Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to talk to you guys about the inspector inside of the Edit tab of Davinci Resolve 14. So in the inspector we have a bunch of different settings we can apply to the clips in our video before we even move on to the color tab. And you would basically bring out this inspector by clicking on Inspector in the top right hand section. You'll notice that when we are in the inspector that only one of the preview windows, the one for the clips on the timeline, actually shows up, and the other one for the clips in our media pool is pushed aside. So starting at the top we have a composite, and what composite is for the clip that we are currently selecting, we can basically tell it to interact with other clips beneath it in a different way. So in this case I have a completely separate second video basically layered on top of this other clip down here. Now in the composite for that video, I have the opacity lowered down. This is kind of otherwise known as alpha. So if you want a clip to only be partially visible and to let whatever's underneath it partially show through, this is one way you can do it by adding an opacity. But there's also this thing called composite mode, where you can change how this clip is going to interact with the one beneath it. So by default, it's just kind of layered on top of it as a partially visible image. But there's other settings here. If you've ever used Photoshop, they have the same kind of compositing tools for images and layers and that. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how each of these individually interact with the video beneath it. But there's a lot of cool effects you can kind of play around with here. Maybe in a future video we'll explain it a little bit more what all of these are exactly, but you can kind of see that you can get a lot of different effects going on. Beneath composite we have the transform section where we have a lot of different tools for basically changing the base appearance of a video clip. So with this main clip selected, we can do things like zoom in and out, pretty self-explanatory. If you want to make something closer to the digital camera or further away, we can zoom in and out in order to do that. Though note that when you zoom in a lot, it's going to lose some of the outer detail because only so much basically footage or space is available on the output clip. We can also change the position. So if we drag X to the left, it's going to move the clip to the left. And if moving the position basically means that this clip has no more data to the right, you'll be left with black space behind it. So be careful about doing that. Likewise, we can move up and down in the y-axis. Now, if you combine zoom with position X or position Y, you can actually get away with changing the position while not ending up with any black space. And of course, you can actually do effects if you set keyframes, which you can start doing by kind of clicking over here, and then you would go to a different point in the clip, and you would set a new keyframe and maybe change the position. So then there's two keyframes set, and we'll get in more into this in the future too. But between those two keyframes, the clip should move a little bit. So you have a little bit of an animation going on there. Obviously, that's really, really simple. But you can set keyframes for almost all of these settings on the inspector. So if you wanted to hint at how to do animation, there you go. Next up, we have rotation angle, where we can have this clip be spun around. So if we took the rotation angle and dragged it around, we could basically spin it all the way, like 360-degree turns, and just keep going and going and going. If you want to spin the clip around 100 times, I don't know. Or we could just set it at a number like 90 degrees if we want to turn it on its side. Next up, we have a different variation on rotation called pitch and yaw, where instead of rotating basically on the X and Y axes, we kind of add in a 3D effect to it, where the pitch is going to be rotating it, basically so that the bottom or the top comes closer to us or further away, depending on if the pitch is positive or negative. And then yaw is the same, except it's for the horizontal. So if we want the right side to be away from us and the left side to come close, we add a positive yaw. And we can also get the exact opposite, have the left side be further away from us and the right be closer to us by having a negative yaw. The last tool here, flip, is really self-explanatory. If we had a clip and we wanted it to basically show up on the other side, basically everything's flipped across the x-axis, we can do a horizontal flip. So this means that everything that was facing the left is now facing the right. It inverts the direction that the clip is facing. We can do the same thing, a vertical flip, where everything that was facing the bottom is now facing the top. And of course, you can combine these tools however you want to get your final video output. So the next section we have here is called cropping, where if there's part of our clip that we actually want to just cut off in the final video output, we can add crop left to remove part of whatever's on the left. We can crop right to remove part from the right, crop top to remove basically data from the top, cropped bottom to remove from the bottom. You can combine all of these in however much cropping as you want. And if we add softness to any section that we've cropped, what's going to happen is that crop ceases to become a hard crop, but more of a gradual transition. And we can increase that softness as much as we want. Basically, the more softness, the slower that transition is. Now, you can also do negative softness. And negative softness, what happens is instead of the softness being on the outside, it now is on the inside. So the crop still kind of happens at the original point, where you can see these lines right here. But then the fade in is actually on the inside itself. So it's still cropping everything outside of those lines, but then it's also having a fade effect on the inside rather than on the outside of that crop line. So one more useful tool in the Inspector tab is called Dynamic Zoom. So when you hit the swap button, it's going to toggle between zooming in and zooming out as long as you have this enabled on your clip, which you can do by basically clicking on the enable toggle. So let's see, right now it is actually zooming the camera out, but as soon as I hit swap and we go back to the start of the clip, it's going to be a zoom in on the clip. So this is pretty useful if you want a clip to basically be a zoom for the entire duration of the clip. And one way you can set the duration by using this is just to basically make a cut when you want that dynamic zoom to end. And one way you can control the duration is by just making a cut when you want the dynamic zoom to end and basically splitting one clip into two clips. Now, there's another tool here called Dynamic Zoom Ease. If you've ever used easing in any other animation-based program, you have four settings here: linear, ease in, ease out, and ease in and ease out. When it's a linear zoom, that means it's going to be proceeding at the same pace for the entire duration of the clip, which means a constant speed. When you have ease in, it's going to start slow and it'll build up speed as it gets to the end. When you have ease out, it's going to start fast and it's going to slow down as it gets to the end. You'll be able to see this a lot easier if I make this clip faster, so you can see it gets slower as we progress. And to show ease in really quick, starts slow, but then it gets faster as we go to the end. Linear, it's constant speed once again. And then ease in and ease out means that it starts and ends slow, but then in the middle is where it's going to be fast. So if you ever use any tool we have easing involved in it, it's pretty much going to work the same way. So Adobe Flash, or I think they're calling it Adobe Animator or whatever, it would work the same way. So that's basically all there is for dynamic zoom. So down here towards the bottom, we have retime and scaling. Now these settings you can also set by going up to the File menu, Project Settings, and then categories like Image Scaling, the resize filter, and Mismatched Resolution files to set these settings for the entire project. But if you want to have them set at the individual clip level, you can do it here. Obviously, by default, it's set to project settings. So retime process, what this is going to mean is when you do basically a time-based effect like speeding up a clip, it's going to give you differing levels of quality while basically taking up more system resources to generate those effects, depending on what setting you have here. So in this section, it's ordered in sequence from the fastest effects to the highest quality effects. So if you want basically the time effects to get the best results, but also take the longest to render in your project, you could use optical flow. But if you just want a quick basically time effect speeding up the clip, you could set that to nearest. So in the next section, scaling, we have 4 different options we can choose from. So the first one is called crop, where if your image is larger than the timeline settings, which we can actually demonstrate here, I'll go up to project settings and we'll change it so that the project settings are lower than the actual clip. You can see that the edges just get cropped off, just like up here where we would have manual cropping, except this happens automatically. So the next setting is called fit, where whatever the dimensions are for your image, it's going to scale it upwards if necessary until either horizontally it reaches the edges of your footage or vertically it reaches the edges of your footage. It's going to keep the same ratio in your video, but it will stop when either horizontally it reaches the edge or vertically it reaches the edge. With fill, it's going to keep going until both sides have actually reached the edge. So the side that's longer is going to, in a sense, be cropped a little bit because it kept scaling upwards until the side that was further away from reaching the edge has actually reached the edge. So in that way, one side will look perfect, but the other sides will be cropped. That said, it does maintain the same perfect ratio that it had before. And then stretch, what it will do is, regardless of the size of your video, it will scale both sides to the size of your project settings, your video output settings. The downside is that it won't keep the same ratio unless it can. So if your video output settings are the same ratio as your clip settings, then it'll be okay. It'll just stretch. But if your output ratio is different, then you may get some distortions. Now, whenever you are scaling your clips up and down inside of your video, you will go through something called the resize filter, which the point of putting it through the filters is to help it look better in the final video output. And these are organized from basically the highest quality filter to the fastest filter. So if you want to get the best quality, you would probably go with sharper. And then if you're looking for the fastest render times in a project that has a lot of resizes, you can come down here to bilinear, where you may lose some output quality, but at faster rendering times, being less processor intensive. Now, once again, all of these settings you can do for the entire project by going up to File, Project Settings. And you can change things in image scaling, the resize filter, mismatched resolution files. But as I mentioned before, you can change all of these settings as well by going up to File and Project Settings and finding the corresponding setting to change it at the project level where it'll apply to all clips by default. And then the only clips that do differently are the ones where you've manually changed it away from project settings to another setting like crop.